Why do corporations always cut positions rather than cut salaries? If you begin cutting people's salaries, they are more than likely going to begin looking for work elsewhere. They know what they are worth, they know what they bring to the table. For you to take a pay cut as an individual reflects upon you personally. Your worth as an individual does not change because a company needs more staff. You could then lose staff members it would be valuable to keep. If you recognize that you're not going to be able to afford to keep paying the number of staff you have, ending contracts can be the best way to keep control over the situation in terms of who stays and who goes. Unfortunately, the powers that be often have the upper hand in these situations and leave people further down the chain with very few options. Cutting everyone's salary will hurt morale of the entire organization, while cutting positions primarily affects those impacted. The larger organization will have a short memory and carry on. If you cut jobs, you are in effect telling the other people that you value them. In many cases, they will actually work harder. If you cut wages, you are saying that you do not value them, and they will have no incentive to work more than the minimum. Different industry, but sometimes companies do cut salaries instead of, or in addition to cutting positions. Bear in mind that each position costs maybe 1.3 times the salary variable. This means that if a company is going to cut salaries instead of positions, they need to cut it by something like 1.3 times more. So a 10 pay cut vs cutting 7 or 8 people. The other factor is that this pay cut will not be well received, especially by the best team members, and they might leave. But the company can selectively cut its bottom performers. I am not in the same field as you, but I believe I know the answer. It is rationally the least harmful to the business option. In my field, there have been layoffs. I could be laid off tomorrow, or someone else will be. Probably 10 of us will be impacted. Of course, this reduces morals for the remaining 90, but we'll eventually get over it, convince ourselves that the worst had passed, and generally expect favorable raises and bonuses in the upcoming cycle, as management focuses on retention. Now let us consider your scenario if leadership comes to me and my managers with the news that we'd all be taking pay cuts to avoid layoffs. Then at least 50 of us will be applying for jobs and contacting recruiters the very next day, and 100 of us will reduce their productivity and performance. Motivation will be gone. We'd also expect that the worst is yet to come. It is even worse, because the remaining 50 who won't be seeking jobs are actually the least productive and least performing employees. Those are the ones who won't be offended by pay cuts. So if an organization doesn't want to kill itself, it would always choose layoffs over pay cuts. I worked in academia. I was told by HR that their plan was to cut the bottom performing 10% of workers each year until they had all, as on the bell curve. They were open that if you were in a this year, with all of the D performers gone, you would probably fall in the rankings to a B, since the bell curve would be getting tighter and tighter. In 5 years, you could end up cut as well, especially since they anticipated an exodus of the C performers, self-selection which they planned to replace with as. Imagine you are one of those administrators. You do not think you are overpaid and likely believe you are actually underpaid. You lose 2-5 of your salary to inflation every year. Your company comes to you and says they are decreasing your salary by another 10 this year due to budget cuts. You are effectively losing at least 12 of your pay this year vs last, and your company has now shown you they are willing to cut your pay. You have a mortgage, children, and bills that you have calculated you can afford based off your salary. If you take a 12 pay cut, you can only barely afford what you easily could have before doing the same job. If you stay with this company, and they decide next year they need to take another 10 pay cut, you might not be able to afford your life despite working just as much. You can't rely on them not to do this. Your only real option is to look for new work, because you cannot trust your current income to be consistently able to afford your life. If you're the business, you can either do this to your entire team, and virtually guarantee that all of them are forced to look for new work and lose the entire team, which it will be very expensive to replace, or you can eliminate one position. If they cut the salaries of administrators who are seriously overpaid to start with, and other higher paid employees by just 5-10K a year, there's your answer right there. For some reason we decided a few decades ago that schools needed more admins and upper mid managers, so all of the money went to the people who don't actually teach, and so the people actually doing the teaching were the ones who got the shaft. If you fire one person, you save 100,000 and you piss off one person who doesn't work for you. You would have to cut 100 workers with 1,000 to save the same, and you piss off 100 people that do work for you. It's a no-brainer. The 80/20 rule applies. 20 of the people do 80 of the valuable work. You don't want to cut salary for the people doing the work. I genuinely believe that the real reason is because cutting at muscle and bone is a way of punishing people in such a brutal way that the only response can be to vote for a higher budget. We saw this during the economic crisis 15 years ago. State and local budgets were in crisis, and again, they cut the programs that people really wanted and needed. The silly shit was always safe. Because if they cut the silly shit and no one noticed a drop-off in quality of life, there'd be no reason to restore past funding levels. If you make people hurt, they'll vote you more money. Kind of off topic, but does anyone know of a CEO that cut their own salary rather than lay people off? Of course it's greed. In fact, the only way to get ahead is to invest in the companies doing the greed, i.e. the stock market. The only money they could cut from would be their own. Usually, corporations are already paying the bare minimum to employees. Poor management doesn't realize that cutting staff reduces both morale and productivity. If they treated their staff better, they would get the savings they want by better productivity. People would quit, but companies sometimes will freeze salary raises for a while. At least in most governments in the US, salaries are often very regulated with contracts either through law, policy regulation, and/or union contracts and pressure from the union. It's nearly impossible to cut someone's salary and for them to keep the same position. But if funding expires either through grants or a temporary boost in tax funds, it's easy to eliminate those specific positions. Cut everyone's salary and everyone will leave. When hiring employees, there are more factors to consider outside of their wage that the business owner has to pay. Taxes, insurance, workers' comp, training, etc. So ridding a position saves a lot more than lowering pay cuts. Show me a public school district in the US that pays a living wage to its licensed staff. Teachers qualify for public assistance in some areas. I get what you were saying, but how do you cut wages when they are already shamefully low?